Hello, delighted and honoured to be here actually. It was extraordinary watching the Petracucha. So much amazing stuff going on. So I'll see what I can contribute. My name's Indy, Johar. I'm from 00. We're a practice, London-based practice, started in 2004. And I suppose I want to talk about how a little bit about our journey over the last 10 years and a little bit of where we're starting to look into the future of kind of what we think the profession can start to change and evolve into. And no, they're not ready yet. Okay, let's do this without slides. Let's have some fun. So 00 started in 2004 in London. I trained at Bath, as did David Saxby, co-founder in Bath. One of the things that we became very interested in was I worked at Panora & Prasad's with Sunand, and one of the things that we became fascinated by was PFI. Many architects hate PFI. That was a universal kind of, we all hate it. But one of the things that I found fascinating about PFI was that PFI allowed architecture to think through a 20-year value cycle. So, for example, I was part of building Green Ride Lane in South London, and one of the things that we were able to do was look at the long-term cost of cleaning or air conditioning and maintaining air conditioning, and effectively we got rid of air conditioning because the cost of maintaining air conditioning over 20 years was going to be so significant that we were able to actually invest all that money into the capital build. So what PFI did was allowed us to think through the life cycle of a project. It stopped us having to think about capital versus revenue cost, and it allowed us to think through the project as a whole, which means you could get rid of painted doors and painted skirtings, all these simple banal things, because you realize that every time you ended up painting the doors, you would end up having to close the room down. So when you start to think about architecture through this lens of actually over a 20-year period, it fundamentally changes the product. And that was one of the big lessons I learned at P&P. And one of the things that ended up setting up was, how do we start to think about this? We've been fortunate enough to end up building quite a few things, including Architecture 00, Open Desk, multiple impact hubs, and so on. But I want to talk a little bit about where I think the future space lies and what the kind of opportunities are around this stuff. And in a way, this equation for me is just profoundly interesting, which is basically the equation between what it costs for design costs, which is about 10%, and I mean full design fees, not just architects, capital costs, which is 1.5, which is the maintenance cost of that building, 8 is the value or the cost of employees in that building itself, and actually any local and economic multiplier. So what that means is the gearage of design to actually employee outcome is 1 to 80. 1 to 80, right? That is extraordinary. Yet we often talk about architecture to the capital side, capital investment side. So we often talk about architecture about the real estate function. What we don't talk about is architecture to the performative outcome of the environments that we build. Now, when you start to look at that, and then we don't even talk about what it builds, to actually think about architecture as a local economic multiplier, how does that piece of architecture improve and advance actually the economics of that local condition? Now, fascinating for me is that allows you to fundamentally change the conversation. It allowed us to change the conversation of how we were designing and how we were building. Allowed you to think about all these things in a completely different format. And when you start to combine these things, you design different products. And what we ended up realizing was that actually you weren't ending up just designing physical buildings, you were actually starting to look at designing the flows and processes and the systems behind them, including the supply chains and inventing the supply chains around them, which was, for me, fascinating in terms of the whole process. So Printworks, we ended up building accelerators for local supply chains, local sandwich shops. So you start to think through not just the physical product, but the social product that underpins it. One of the first times we did that was Bristol Urban Beach in 2007, where we literally built an urban beach with 80,000 people turning up. And we ended up losing a bit of money as we did it, because we made a joint venture with the bars, who effectively, we had a profit share. Don't do profit shares. never do profit shares. But what you see, we had 80,000 people turn up, not one crime incident. But what was fascinating was we ended up realizing that the only way we could do this stuff was actually to be the entrepreneur in the process. You couldn't outsource it. You couldn't consult entrepreneurship. You couldn't tell someone else to be entrepreneurial and say, take some risk. We ended up building a lot of this stuff. And we ended up, in that same process, looking at, once we'd done a few of this stuff, we ended up working with Somerset House, building their strategy in terms of how they grew the whole ecosystem around Somerset House. Now, we ended up wrote books, and that's the other thing. We stopped writing books about ourselves. So that's one of the things I just genuinely would recommend. This kind of vanity publication story is really shit. Write content, right? Write content, contribute to the knowledge of the world, and people will recognize you for it, right? Please do not write publications about yourself. It's just like dull, right? So we ended up writing a book called Compendium for the Civic Economy, which was actually about what we thought was actually a new way of organizing around that time. We ended up building, I'm going to do this stuff just to be able to show a context, and I'll change. So that we also built Impact Hub Birmingham recently. But as you can see, behind building Impact Hub Birmingham was a whole bunch of other activity, from TEDx going from 100 people to TEDx being now 1,000 people this year. So we ended up building a community as well as just a physical product in that process. And then building physical buildings, hubs, Somerset House with Studio Weave, and buildings around the world, and recently Social Justice Centre, and this is Impact Hub Birmingham, actually, sort of some of the community, and you see Malala is actually one of our members there, which is extraordinary. So what I wanted to say was the first thing we realized was actually how do you think of architecture not as a physical product, but actually as a social product, as a thing of flows of things, flows of social processes, flows of pipelines, flows of actual supply chains, and all these sort of things. That fundamentally changes what you build and how you build it. And it also changes the emotional attachment and what you can build. So when we crowdfunded Impact Hub Birmingham with £68,000, right, from citizens, which wasn't about the money, but it was about changing the psychological relationship of citizens to that facility and how it was built and how it was designed. Second, what we realized was actually not only could you actually change the way you think about architecture, you could also start to change the way you build it. So this is a piece of, this is kind of looking at the kind of fourth industrial revolution and what the implications are. But we also ended up looking at, well, if you could democratize the means of manufacture, what would that start to do? And as part of that process, we ended up doing something called WikiHouse, which is open source housing, which allows us to be able to 3D print houses, a bit like IKEA, but actually 3D route them. This was 2011, just to give you in context, right? And now there's kind of like 60-odd communities around the world who are iterating and varying these houses around the world in various formats. And I don't know if this will work. I don't know if the video works on this. Maybe, maybe not. But you'll see that this has now got a global network, literally a global network, where people in Christchurch took the house and actually made it earthquake-proof and reinvented it and shared it back. And you can 3D route it off people. Off the back of that, we ended up building an open-source furniture company, which this is the stool. I think it's exhibited pretty much in most of the major museums around the world now. When we launched it, we open-sourced the furniture, and this was in 4 weeks. We had 8,000 downloads literally around the world, where people were downloading it in Ghana, Singapore, printing it, and then changing us. Hey, we can do it with X material. Hey, we can improve these details, and sending it back to us. And that ended up setting up, and you can see it's opendesk.cc, you can see it, and you can pretty much download, and we were printing and delivering furniture. We now deliver furniture pretty much anywhere in the world, usually printed within 7 miles of any location, anywhere in the world, usually within 7 days, right? Just to give you a context, all 3D routed locally and printed as part of a 600 maker network around the world. Relatively, and we've been printing furniture for all the big organizations around the world. Off the back of that. So, the next part I want to talk about is off the back of that, what did we end up learning? And for me, one of the big things is kind of something what I call the boring revolution. So first, how do you think about architecture as a system? Second thing, how do you change the actual means of making? The third thing I think that we're in the middle of is a kind of boring revolution, which is a revolution of bureaucracy, of the nature of how we organize stuff. And one of the things that we became more and more confident about as we started to think about financial models and systems of financial models and how do you start to think about them. And we had over the previous period supported 2 social investment accelerators, one in India, one in the UK. So we started to understand how to put a lot of this stuff together. We started to think about new investment models for urban renewal. And that's been a lot of the stuff. So we've been looking at system financing models, which you can read about. But we also looked at actually what would happen when you started to think about smart covenants. What would happen if you could fund new parks using smart covenant models adjacent to local property? So what we started to realize was that technology was allowing us to create foundationally different business models, which allowed us to actually fund new common goods in a way that we've never seen before. So we don't have an architecture for building common infrastructure anymore. And that's largely public funded, centralized, and that's been killed off in many ways. And this is for the Camden High Line. So we just did a piece of work looking at actually what are the funding architectures around this stuff. Churches and many of the things that we talked about are built using covenants and or maintained using certain instruments like covenants. How could they be reimagined for the 21st century around that process? We've ended up doing a lot of work around AV, which is autonomous vehicles, and how could you finance autonomous vehicles on the basis of releasing car parking space, on the basis of actually air pollution reduction and various other things. So you start to see the value creation at a system level rather than an object level, and in that process, all the way through to reimagining sort of land rights. And so this is a piece of work that we've been doing in Stockholm around how you could reimagine land rights all the way from use classes. So what would happen if we got rid of planning use classes fundamentally and effectively talked about outcome-based planning, which was driven entirely through sensors? So you no longer say this is industrial and this is actually employment. What you talk about is what's the pollution effects? Is it noise, sound, smell, pollution effects? How do we start to actually build the architecture, which is entirely sensor and data driven? How do you create new liquidity in this model of how we think about it? Suddenly, restaurants and houses can be coexisting in a way that we've not imagined before. So I don't know if many of you know, in Helsinki there's a day where nationally anyone can open a restaurant pretty much any location around the world. And that's been really fascinating in terms of challenging use class ideologies that we've all borne up with. And why I bring this sort of stuff to the table right now, and this is why I suppose I'm going to pause here, is I think technology is about to change the very nature of how we make our cities. Not just physically, but actually the regulatory infrastructure side of it, as well as the funding infrastructure side of it. Funding, in a way, form doesn't follow function, form follows finance. Right? You want to change the future of architecture, change the future of financing. You want to change actually the nature of how our cities are functioning and organized, well, actually look to the future. I think we're about to see the rise of the post-managerial city. London is a classic managerial city based around large footprint offices. And as we saw the rise of post-industrial cities and the death of industry, so we're about to see the death of management environments and management infrastructure. Start to think about the medium-term changes that are coming, and they're going to be significant to the level that we're not really talking about, certainly not in the profession. But technology is fundamentally changing our bureaucracy and our means of bureaucracy. Look into the 5-year horizon, and I think we're going to see radically different cities in a way that we've not really discussed before. What does that mean to actually digital design? And kind of BIMS is really just the first step of a very, very initial story. What happens when actually building products become performance-driven in a way that we've not seen before? What happens when you look at actually a lot of the stuff in terms of digital regulation, real-time compliance, when things start to talk about real-time compliance of buildings? So you don't talk about compliance, I've had building regs done once. What happens when building regs is real-time? It will change the nature of how we comply, but also allow us to build and design things in a way that we've never imagined before. Keep going, right? So data-driven, in terms of the data sets around our building societies, what does that compliance really foundationally look like? What does actually a building log look like when you talk about smart receipts? How does that allow buildings to be fully hackable in a way that we've never seen before? Change the warranty infrastructure. So one of the things we learned about the Wiki House was you could build the Wiki House, but unless you could build a warranty infrastructure, you couldn't allow somebody to get a mortgage on it. Right? So you had to build a different warranty infrastructure to allow people, an additive warranty infrastructure to allow people to be able to edit and innovate it in different contexts. This background, this dark matter of innovation is, I think, going to change our industry more significantly than we're talking about. It's really lovely I can show you nice, sexy projects. That's the easy bit. But the really interesting revolution we're in the middle of is this dark matter. What did Airbnb and Uber really do? They got rid of cab offices, right? What did Uber really do? It destroyed the cab office. It didn't destroy the taxi, it didn't destroy anything, it destroyed the cab office. We're seeing a fundamental change in the nature of our bureaucracy. That's the thing to keep an eye on, and I think that revolution has really only just started. And then you can also look at outcome-based financing. So what would financing look like if you were looking at, say, imagine a retail store, right? A retail store, you could price the rent on a retail store on the basis of footfall. Real-time footfall, a real-time smart contract around rent. What would that do to the person who's curating the street when you can start to do real-time curation of that street to advance footfall? That fundamentally means that you can animate public realm in a way that we've historically never been able to do. Now, why I bring that up is those small, boring things, I think, are going to change the nature of how we create places. I'm running out of time. But I think we've got a full stack of innovation going on, all the way from built environment, all the way to the kind of nature of how we finance it. And I think that, to me, is the real challenge. I'm going to flick through a few of these slides. Look, my 3 takeaways, which I'm going to end on here, is that for us, being small was a superpower, because it actually allowed us to be relational to the problem. When we understood WikiHouse, the real challenge of WikiHouse was additive insurance. We ended up going out there and saying, right, we're going to build a new insurance product. It allowed us to go deep through the problem rather than actually just surface on the process that we needed to manage. I think the foundational thing, design, I think we're going to end up designing the architecture of the place, not the buildings. And I think as far as I saw it, all the people that I saw in the kind of first few 10 picture pictures, they were all hinting at that future. That is a foundationally different way of behaving. And actually, it's all about interface of different components. They're not just physical components, but there are other types of components that we're pulling together. That, I think, is going to be really foundational in our change. And I think also, for me, small is a place where new ideas are born. So small for me is not about being apologetic. It's also about being a place with agility, where we have the ability to craft the new future. And I think that is where we are. And I really strongly implore the profession to start to think about the scale of opportunity and transformation we're in the middle of. I think our cities are going to look radically different. And they're going to look radically different in a way that we've not even begun to imagine. And it's going to be because the bureaucracy of how we organize is changing. And that will change form in a way that we've never seen before. With that, I'll end. Thank you.